111. Okay. Hi, everyone. I hope things are well with you and that you had a good break. I apologize for not being back yet, but as you all are all aware of, there were some issues that I had to deal with over here in the Middle East. So I will resume here where we had stopped. I had given you the video about invasive species to look at, and we will be doing the same for today and for Tuesday, and I will be back on Thursday to pick up where we had left. I will also post on Brightspace the changes in assignment dates and some changes that I have to do to the curriculum to accommodate the unforeseen circumstances. The topic for today and Tuesday are communities and metapopulations. We had started communities before we had gone out to break, but I want to continue on to make sure that you have all the information that you must have in order to succeed in understanding the idea of communities and interactions. So, just as a review, we've already gone over the majority of the first few slides here, but I want to make sure that the information is captured and that we don't lose information I'm sure you have forgotten over the break. So what is a community? It is a number of populations of different species that share the same space. And what we tend to measure in community biology, okay, and when we're thinking about communities, we're thinking about diversity, the number of species that exist in the system. Really what we're interested in is the amount of energy that is stored in the community and how it passes through. So when we thought about how we measure a population, we talked about that a few weeks ago, what we end up having to do is actually consider how do we measure a community. And one of the things that we tend to think about is biomass, or the amount of energy that is stored in a system and the species that live within it. So again, what we study in community ecology, specifically what we're studying, is that energy flow. How do we study it? We tend to think and create diagrams of food webs, interactions between species, who eats who competes with who. We tend to add pluses and minuses, we did in class already, to relate the relationship between the two players or individual species within that community. And we tend to show essentially how the energy flows within that space. Again, we looked at another example of a food web here, but the regular shape may be less attractive or artistic, tends to be stratified in different levels. Oops. And why are they stratified? Well, it basically represents the different levels of the trophic pyramid, of how much energy is stored at every one of those different levels. The higher up or upper we are in our diagram, the less energy actually is stored within that group. This should be again a review, and what we see essentially is that with every step up in the community, within the food chain, we lose 10% or tenfold amount of the energy. So we start off with 20,000 in plants, we go down to 2,000 in the primary consumers or the herbivores, to 200 in the secondary consumers or the ones that eat insects and small herbivores, and upwards all the way to the apex predators that are storing a really small fraction of the amount of energy that the plants originally had. Where does all of that extra energy go? As you eat and you digest your food, you expel heat into the environment. So heat is the first way that we lose energy. And the second one is anything that dies or decomposes, all that energy moves into decomposers and then is recycled either through heat back into the universe or back into the plants that can use that up to generate new biomass and start the process all over. So when we think about community interactions, we tend to think about direct effects and indirect effects. The direct effects specifically tend to look at competition. Essentially, the majority of interactions on this planet are competitive. And the major one is resource competition. If I'm competing with you for my food or for space or for water, we are directly competing against each other. For Again, in this case, we've got an oak and a maple, and they are competing for the energy of the sun and therefore grow their canopies to cover as much space to block out the light from other plants from using that light. If I go back here, and let me create a little laser pointer. If you look at the interactions here, I mark them with two negatives. The oak has a negative effect on the maple, and the maple has a negative effect on the oak. We have to relate those dynamics and think about them, how they're relating to each other. Always keep in our minds, where is the energy flowing? For a bigger oak, there's a smaller maple. For a bigger maple, there's a smaller oak. There are more maples, there are fewer oaks. There are more oaks, there are fewer maples. It's always a negative effect. Another type of competition is predation. Essentially, if I eat you, that energy is transferred to me. So I am competing and I win in that competition. So in this case, the bear and the salmon, the bear receives the energy, the salmon loses that energy, does not reproduce, and therefore the bear is the stronger competitor in that interaction. In parasitism, this is where we stopped actually before the break. In parasitism, the parasites consume some of the energy, but it does not kill the prey. So they're taking some of the energy, but not all of it. Okay, and the prey try to get rid of the predator, the parasites, by kicking them off, scratching them off, eating them, etc., to try to remove them and stop the energy sapping coming from them into the parasites. Mutualism is a positive dynamic where both partners, both players, both species in the interaction gain energy from each other. So there are some species of acacia trees in Africa that produce food and shelter for ants, and the ants in return give them protection from predators and stop their herbivores from eating them, thus them losing energy to their competitors. In this dynamic, both the players, both the species in the interaction gain from living together. So we call that mutualism. Symbiosis, as you'll recall from your biodiversity class, refers to the living together or communal interaction of two species, which could be both mutualistic, commensalistic, or amensalistic. We're going to get to those in a second. So again, those pairwise interactions, direct effects. Pairwise means one, two, only two interactions. Parasitism, one gains, one loses. Mutualism, both benefit. Amensalism is one is negatively affected and the other is not affected. So in other words, if I am living in an environment where I am not affected by, let's say, the plants living around me, which is of course not true because we gain something from them, but the plants are hurt from me cutting them or stomping on them, then they lose energy. The best example of this is actually comes from the bacterial world and fungi world, where, for example, penicillin produces penicillin, kills off the bacteria around it. That's how we have in antibiotics, but it does not get any value or any benefit from living in that environment or gaining something out of it. And commensalism is the opposite. Essentially, where one species gets something and the other one does not. We tend to refer to those as pests, where essentially they live in our environment, they might hurt us economically, but they're not hurting our energy. And as a consequence, they are hurting our ability to make a living, but they're not necessarily going to kill us. They're not parasites or predators. But they definitely gain from the advantages of living near us because we provide them food. And then, of course, we can go to the indirect effects. And the indirect effects basically say, if I'm using another species to have the effect on you, then the interaction essentially goes indirectly and impacts you in another way. So let's start with apparent and exploitative. Okay, these are the two extreme ones on the two sides. The apparent competition essentially says, if we share a predator, okay, we are basically positively affecting each other because for each one of you that gets eaten, I don't get eaten. Okay, so in other words, if I'm competing with you, okay, through your predators, that is called apparent competition. Exploitative is if it goes by, if I eat more of your food, you will have less food. So in other words, a competition is not just for light, for example, or space, which is a direct interaction. Instead of that, I am actually eating and consuming your food and thus making you less fit. So one species impacting the other by consuming its food. And last, we've got the interference one, which is simply by pushing you out of the space where the resources are. And essentially that is, in most cases, the most direct way of competition, by saying, if I am here, you cannot be here, and I've pushed you out of your habitat or out of this environment. So if I look at this diagram here, I can look at a couple of interactions. Fox squirrels and oaks. Right? The squirrels eat the oak, the acorns, the nuts of the oak, right? The acorns right here. And thus they are their predators. The gray squirrels also eat the same acorns. So the competition between the fox squirrels and the gray squirrels is both a exploitative competition, right? It's an interference competition because they're pushing each other out of the way. They are also, well, I don't have a predator here, but they could also have the same predator. So let's say there's a hawk added to this. They can also have apparent competitions for the predators. The same thing happens with the chipmunks, right? So the same interaction, the same competition, all types of competition actually exist between all these three species. However, the squirrels and both squirrels do not eat the maples. And as a consequence, the competition that exists there between the chipmunks and the gray squirrels is more an interference one. Sorry, interference? Yeah, interference for the space and less for the food. So again, we just added this information here, and we've got, for example, the foxes and the red-tailed hawks and the Cooper's hawks, and they have competition for the same food between themselves, and this whole interaction gets more and more complex. Okay. And then we have some other interactions. Some of them can be within predation, which is called facilitation. Essentially, that is a positive effect. In other words, where one predator might aid another predator to get its prey. So let's say we've got a weasel, and he's going after this gopher in the hole. Okay, this little gopher is sitting there. The weasel can get into the holes and eat the gophers. So when the weasel comes around, the gopher runs out of the burrow, goes out of its environment and into the open, and then the hawk might essentially come in and eat the gopher or the ground squirrel or I guess this was a prairie dog, not a gopher, but still same idea. And then the hawk can eat that prey. So the weasel has a positive effect on the hawk, while the hawk does not have a positive effect on the weasel. When we look at interactions over multiple levels, we call those trophic cascades. In other words, remember we had the trophic pyramid, where we went from the plants, the producers, to the herbivores, the primary consumers, to the mesocarnivores or mesopredators, predators that have their own predators that are the secondary carnivores, to essentially the apex predator. We have a cascade of differences. If I'm looking at the energy flow, the flow can go down from the plants upwards. That's a bottom up flow of energy. Or I can have an effect that is top down, where the predators have an effect on all the other tiers below it. So let's look at some examples here. If I've got a gray fox that eats a fox squirrel, and the fox squirrel eats the oak, That is a negative effect of the fox on the squirrel, and a negative effect of the squirrel on the oak. I can then multiply the effects. A negative times a negative becomes a positive. And therefore, the interaction between the fox and the oak becomes a positive one. Okay? In other words, your enemy's enemy is your friend. If you eat someone and that someone eats me, you're benefiting me. That is a positive trophic cascade. Now, we can also have the opposite direction. The oak has a positive effect on the squirrels, right? They eat the oaks and they are able to reproduce and have more squirrels. The more squirrels there are, the more foxes they are, but they can have more food. So that becomes a positive effect on the fox. So both the fox helps the oaks and the oaks help the foxes via an intermediate species, the squirrel. So essentially, lethal effects, the way we think about those positive patterns, is that predators prevent overgrazing by killing the herbivores, and thus the plant reproduce and benefit. We can also have another effect, which is actually where my own research fits in, which is called a non-lethal effect or non-consumptive effect, where essentially predators prevent overgrazing simply by frightening herbivores or pushing them out of their environment and going somewhere else. And even they don't have to kill them. By scaring them away, enough of the plants will survive and grow and reproduce. We call that the ecology of fear. Another example, here's an interesting article that shows that hummingbirds prefer to actually nest under the nests of actual hawks, because the predators won't come and kill the eggs of the hummingbirds. So there's a real advantage for hummingbirds to nest near a predator that's not fast enough to kill them, but will protect their eggs from their own predators. It's kind of that same idea or same effect. So the ecology of fear, or the field of work that I work in, essentially dictates or drives the distribution of animals, especially prey, through a landscape. So let's look at a couple of examples here, why we study this idea or concept in conservation biology, that we can assess where an animal will choose to be based on the risk in the environment that's caused by its predators. We can also change the levels of risk by hunting, by introducing predators. And we can select where the animals are present if we're trying to reduce impacts of a species that has a really bad impact over like overgrazing or an invasive species. Or we can encourage a species to move into an environment by removing the risks and causing them to come to that environment. And essentially, we can use the risk to manage habitat for positive and negative consequences. So, because we understand that animals choose where to be based on the risk in the environment, we can then drive the dynamics or the interactions of species to where they end up and get the benefits we want to their populations, which essentially is what conservation biology does. So this is an example from a paper by my colleague John Landry. He coined the term a landscape of fear in 2001, where the interaction, the trophic cascade that is discussed here is that elk that live in Yellowstone National Park, they eat the bark of willow trees, okay, when the grass is covered with snow in winter. The bark kills those trees, and those trees then cascade down and impact the physical environment, okay, in this case the rivers, okay, and essentially when there are no willows and aspen trees around, the rivers flow faster and straighter and become colder, which changes what fish and insects can live in them. In 1995, wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park to try to help stop the overgrazing, basically the overchewing of the bark of the willows and the aspens that kept them alive for a longer or to a longer period or longer distance of years and allowed the rivers to slow down. So the rivers constrain the elk from escape the wolves, because the wolves will circle their prey and the river becomes a barrier to movement. So the elk move away from the rivers and into the plains where they can run in 360 degrees of direction. They want to be able to escape the wolves and be safe. So did it actually work? This is 2 years after the reintroduction of the environment. You will see that over here there is a river. It's pretty straight in its flow, and the vegetation is pretty boring, right? It's all the same grass, a few of the same trees, but there's not much diversity of plants. The exact same spot. Okay, you can see the river, the what's called a gonna come back to me. But anyway, the riverside vegetation that grows along the rivers is starting to regenerate and grow beautifully. Okay, this is now 6 years after the reintroduction of the wolves. And by 2010, you really cannot recognize that there's even a river in the middle there. There's now meandering and slow and warmer. And the environment looks completely different, even though all these 3 photos were taken the exact same spot. Another example of a trophic cascade that is interesting, that has a positive effect. Sea urchins. Okay, you've seen their skeletons in biodiversity. They eat kelp, and they bring down and collapse the kelp forest by overgrazing it. Sea otters, this is actually a seal, not a sea otter. The sea otters are in here. I need to replace that photo. Will eat the urchins, and by that will help essentially protect the kelp forest, which is a habitat for many species of fish, crustaceans, and mollusks, which essentially live within that space and swim within that space. I will skip this one here, but essentially you can see that when we lose the predators, we lose a lot of other species. So in this situation here, actually this was a positive cascade where the predators were excluded and their prey species increased significantly. So this was a flooding of a valley with a dam. As a consequence, we ended up with a lot more of their prey species, things like lizards, frogs, birds, rodents, monkeys, and leafcutter ants. But of course, that also has a negative effect on all the vegetation that was in that area, because now there's much more herbivores and less and more grazers to those plants. How would I define these ideas or rethink these concepts? We will start with the concept of trophic cascade. And if we have an odd number of levels, the effect will always be positive in terms of top-down. From the top down, if we've got 3 levels or 5 levels or 7 levels in our food chain, within our food web, we end up with a green world. This is a community of species that favors the vegetation, the producers. However, as long as we have 4 levels, we have 3 interactions, one against the other, the effects will always be negative. And essentially, we'll end up with a brown world or desert system where plants are selected against. It's less good for the plants in those environments. If I was to think about the effects, when I'm looking at the interactions, again, I added here another one to a green world again. The vegetation is favored. But I have to think about the directionality of the effects. The trophic cascades are always top-down. The top levels influence the bottom. The number of levels will influence the consequence for vegetation. Bottom up is always positive. Energy always flows from the lower levels on the trophic pyramid to the higher ones. So, again, top-down effects will always be negative. Bottom-up effects will always be positive. A green world will be one which has odd trophic levels, and a brown world will have even trophic levels. And let's stop here for this recording.